Two airplanes, the Airbus A320 and the Boeing 737. Same routes, same passengers, same seats. For decades, engines from the same family, built by the same manufacturer. Now look at the engines. The Airbus engine is a clean circle. The way a jet engine is supposed to look, the way almost every jet engine on Earth looks. The Boeing engine has a flat bottom. Like someone took a belt sander to the underside and shaved it off. Same engine family, same era, same job, and one of them looks like it survived an accident. So why is the Boeing the deformed one? Here's the part nobody expects. The answer has almost nothing to do with the engine. That engine was fine on every other aircraft it was fitted to. What was wrong was the airplane it had to fit onto, and the reason was decided in 1964. Before we get into why, let's make sure you're seeing what I'm describing, because once you notice this, you can't unsee it. Walk up to any 737 on any ramp in the world and look at the engine straight on. The opening isn't a circle. It's closer to an egg that's been squashed, flat along the bottom, still nicely rounded on top. Pilots and engineers have a nickname for it. They call it the hamster pouch. Then look at the sides of that engine casing. You'll spot two bulges, one on each flank, that the Airbus doesn't have. And finally, step back and look at where the engine sits. On most airliners, the engine hangs below and slightly ahead of the wing. On the 737, it's shoved out in front of the wing, and the top of it sits almost level with the top of the wing surface. It's even tilted, nose up, about 5 degrees. None of that is styling, none of it is aerodynamics. Every one of those features is a workaround. And here's what matters. That flat bottom is not an engine problem. It's the visible scar of a decision Boeing made as the design took shape in 1964, a year before the program was formally launched and more than 15 years before this engine existed. A decision about how high off the ground the airplane should sit. That one choice is the reason no 737 can wear a round engine today. So let's go back to 1964, because Boeing was in trouble. The short-haul jet market was already taken. The BAC 111 was flying. The Douglas DC-9 was well into development. Boeing had the 707 and the 727, both built for longer routes, and nothing underneath them. They were late and they knew it. So Boeing did two things to catch up. First, they copied themselves. The fuselage cross-section came straight off the 707 and the 727. The nose came off the 727. Systems, cockpit, parts, all inherited. That saved years. But the second decision is the one that matters here. Boeing deliberately drew the airplane low. Short landing gear, fuselage close to the ground on purpose. Why? Think about who they were selling to. In the mid-1960s, most airports outside the United States and Western Europe were primitive. No jet bridges, no belt loaders, no ground power carts. Sometimes barely a terminal, so Boeing designed a jet that didn't need any of it. Air stairs built into the fuselage so passengers walked straight up. A cargo hold low enough that two people could sling bags in by hand. The engines sat close to the wing and close to the ground, and they fit, because the Pratt & Whitney JT8D engines of that era had a fan only about 40 inches across. Boeing built an airliner that carried its own airport with it. Now, if that sounds like a compromise, I want to be clear, because this is the part most people get wrong. It wasn't a compromise. It was the best feature this airplane had. That low stance is what let the 737 go everywhere. Boeing even certified a factory option called the unpaved strip kit, which let a 100,000-pound jet airliner operate off gravel runways. Airlines bought this jet because it didn't need infrastructure that didn't exist, and some of them still fly it. Nolinor Aviation, out of Quebec, says it operates the world's largest fleet of 737-200s, 8 aircraft averaging over 46 years old, hauling up to 119 passengers or 30,000 pounds of cargo into northern strips where the runway is rock and ice. By the airline's own figure, that costed around 21 man-hours of maintenance for every single hour in the air. Nolinor keeps paying it because nothing else lands there. So put yourself in Boeing's chair in 1975. Your airplane sells because it sits low. Your engines fit because they're small. There's no problem, and no reason on earth to touch any of it. That's exactly why nobody did. For about 15 years, the low stance was a pure advantage with no downside. Then jet engines started getting fat, and everything Boeing had built its success on turned into a trap. Here's the physics, and it's simpler than people assume. A jet engine makes thrust by throwing air backwards. You have two ways to do that. You can throw a small amount of air fast, or you can throw a large amount of air more slowly. Moving a lot of air slowly turns out to be dramatically more efficient. That ratio, how much air goes around the engine core versus through it, is called the by-pass ratio, and raising it is the entire story of jet engine progress over the last 50 years. But there's a catch. To move more air, you need a bigger fan at the front. Higher bypass means a wider engine. Always. And you can watch it happen on this exact airplane. The original JT-8D had a fan of roughly 40 inches. By the late 1970s, the engine everybody wanted was the CFM56, and the version that existed at the time had a fan of 68 inches. That's 28 inches of extra diameter on an airplane drawn to sit as close to the ground as physically possible. And that clearance isn't a nice to have. You need real space under an engine for the moment the nose comes up on takeoff, for a crosswind landing where the aircraft touches down banked, and for a hard landing where the gear compresses and the whole airframe drops. Lose that margin, and you're one bad day from dragging an engine down a runway. By 1981, Boeing had no choice anyway. Fuel prices had spiked, the JT-8D was thirsty and loud, and without a modern high-bypass engine, the 737 was finished. Boeing needed that engine or the airplane was dead. The engine that would save the 737 was the same engine that wouldn't fit it. Now, here's where it gets interesting, because Boeing wasn't the only customer for this engine. Take a look at the list of aircraft the CFM56 family ended up powering. The KC-135R, the American military tanker, the stretched DC-8 Super 70, the Airbus A320, the Airbus A340, and the Boeing 737 Classic. Does anything about that list look off to you? Here it is. Almost every aircraft on that list got a normal round engine nacelle. The DC-8 round, the A320 round, the A340 round. And look at the first one on that list again, because it's the one that settles the argument. The KC-135 is a Boeing airframe. Boeing hung this same engine family on another of its own jets, and that one got a perfectly round cowling. Boeing proved it against itself. One aircraft on that list couldn't have it. And it's the one Boeing has delivered more than 12,000 of. This is the proof that the flat bottom was never about the engine. If the CFM56 were inherently flat-bottomed, every aircraft using it would look that way. They don't. The engine was fine, the airplane was the problem. So Boeing had a 68-inch engine and an airplane with room for about 40. What do? Every engineer already knows the answer. Make the landing gear taller, raise the airplane, and the clearance problem evaporates. It's the obvious fix. It's the clean fix. And Airbus was about to prove it works. So why didn't Boeing do that? Because of money. Specifically, because of what taller gear drags along behind it. Longer legs need somewhere to retract into, which means a bigger wheel well. A bigger wheel well means cutting into the wing structure, which means redesigning the wing box, the gear bay, and the fairings around them. And the moment you redesign primary structure, you're into a full structural recertification program. We know roughly what that bill looks like because Boeing went and priced it decades later. When the company weighed fitting a larger engine to the MAX 10, Reuters reported industry estimates that raising and repositioning the landing gear and recertifying the affected parts would run $1 to $2 billion. And here's the killer. Spend all that, and the 737 stops being a 727 derivative, which was the entire business case. Cheap to develop, cheap to certify, cheap for airlines because the pilots, mechanics, and spare parts they already owned still worked. That commonality was the only real advantage this jet had. Fixing this stance would have destroyed the exact thing that made the airplane worth building. So the verdict is brutally simple. Boeing couldn't afford to raise the airplanes. So Boeing did the other thing. If you cannot raise the plane to fit the engine, you deform the engine to fit the plane. A CFM team, led by an engineer named Marc Gregoire, went to work, and what they did is clever, even if the result is ugly. First, they cropped the fan. That 68-inch fan was cut down to 60 inches for the 737 version, the CFM 56-3. 8 inches of diameter surrendered to the ground. That still was not enough. So they went after the accessories. On a normal jet engine, the accessory gearbox, the box that drives the generators and pumps, hangs underneath the engine core at the 6 o'clock position. Gregoire's team moved it around to the side to 9 o'clock and split the other accessories onto the flanks. Those are the two bulges you can see on every 737 engine. With nothing hanging underneath anymore, they could squash the bottom of the nacelle and the intake lip flat. That's the hamster pouch. Then for the last few inches, they hung the whole engine forward of the wing instead of under it, raised it until the top was nearly level with the wing's upper surface, and tilted it 5 degrees nose up. And here's the thing. It worked. The result was about 20% more efficient than the JT-8D. The classic sold in enormous numbers, and Boeing stayed in the single-aisle business, which is precisely why nobody ever went back and fixed it. But the flat bottom didn't just change how the engine looks, it changed what the engine could do, and not in a good way. Remember the physics from earlier. Efficiency comes from bypass ratio, and bypass ratio comes from fan diameter. So when Gregoire's team cropped that fan from 68 inches down to 60, they didn't only lose 8 inches of metal, they lowered the bypass ratio, which means the 737 received a less efficient version of the same engine its competitors were flying. Boeing paid for the low stance and fuel burn on every flight for decades. Then there's where the engine ended up. Hanging it forward of the wing and tilting it upward solved the clearance problem, but a heavy engine mounted that far ahead of the wing changes how the aircraft behaves when the nose comes up. In 1984, with a 60-inch fan, that effect was small enough to live with. Hold that thought, because it does not stay small. So how do we know this was a choice and not physics? Because Airbus built the control experiment at the same time with the same engine. The A320 was drawn in the 1980s around the CFM56 from the first line on the blueprint with tall landing gear built in from the start. It entered service in April of 1988 with a 68.3-inch fan and completely round nacelles. Airbus didn't solve the ground clearance problem. Airbus never inherited it, and that gap has only widened. When Boeing built the MAX, it needed the LEAP 1B with a fan of 69.4 inches. Its bigger sibling, the LEAP 1A at 78 inches, was ruled out for the 737 immediately. It doesn't fit. That same engine fits the A320neo without drama. So Boeing did the same trick again, harder, 8 inches added to the nose gear. The engine pushed further forward and cantilevered higher. And because a big engine mounted that far forward changes how the airplane pitches at high angles of attack, Boeing added software to compensate. That software was called MCAS. 2 crashes in 2018 and 2019. 346 people were killed. The fleet was grounded for 20 months. The flat cowling and the MAX are not two separate stories. They're the same 1964 decision surfacing 55 years apart. So the next time you're in a window seat looking out at that squashed, flat-bottomed engine, understand what you're looking at. Boeing didn't reshape that engine because physics demanded it. Boeing reshaped it because it couldn't afford to touch the airplane. Have you ever noticed the hamster pouch before, or has it been hiding in plain sight on every flight you've taken? Let me know down in the comments. And if you want the full story of how Boeing ended up trapped by a jet it once tried to sell off entirely, that one is waiting for you next.